Part 2. Dark Spring. Patience, then, without compromise. Silence without surrender. Grim determination, never to cease striving until we can vote, travel, learn, work, and enjoy peace. All this, and yet with it, and above it, all the tramp of our armies over the blood-stained lilies of France, to show the world again what the loyalty and bravery of black men means. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Crisis. Chapter 8. In Flight. A lone British fighter plane soared over no man's land at dawn. From the ground below, sparks of light dotted the clouds in rhythmic patterns. The pilot of the plane, David, knew the signals all too well. Coded messages from German heliographs, wireless solar telegraphs, flashing Morse code. In the rear seat of the plane, Jimmy was alarmed. It was his first time flying ever, but he knew those signals were not good. He patted David's shoulder frantically. David raised one hand to halt him. Bullets whizzed to either side of the plane. Jimmy gripped his seat in terror. He turned his neck as far as he could and saw a German fighter plane closing in. David cursed. A German on their tail was half expected, considering that they were flying close to enemy airspace, but he'd hoped against being detected all the same. The plane raced across the sky. Another hail of machine gun bullets flew past, and David took evasive maneuvers. He knew that their adversary was toying with his prey before the kill. David sighed and said the unthinkable to his junior passenger. "Sorry, kiddo, but you gotta take the gun," David shouted. He wasn't even sure Jimmy could hear him. "What?" Jimmy shouted. David thumbed over his shoulder. Jimmy turned around and looked at a machine gun mounted behind him. "The gun!" David shouted. "Put on the harness first before you stand." Jimmy's knees knocked together. He'd heard about the famous dogfights, even secretly enjoyed the stories about the Red Baron. But Jimmy would never dreamed he'd ever reach the sky himself. Another hail of bullets forced David to put the plane in an aerial spin. When he righted the plane again, he pointed backward at Jimmy over his shoulder. Jimmy couldn't see David's face, but he could imagine the exasperation. "Now!" David shouted. Jimmy said a quick prayer and looked around the sides of the seat. He lifted his goggles to see better. Harnesses were on either side of his seat. Jimmy replaced the goggles and strapped them on. Quivering, Jimmy leaned over the machine gun. Calling upon his machine gun training, Jimmy pulled off a shot. Bullets flew in a circular hail and disappeared into nothingness. The German plane dodged the gunfire with the elegant dip of one wing. Jimmy removed his mask to shout, "What should I do?" into the wind. He knew that David couldn't hear him, but he tried anyway. David sensed that they were short on time. The next time his enemy fired, it would be for the kill. David yanked the controls and said a quick prayer for Jimmy. David took the plane upward in the dizzying loop, higher and higher. He could swear that he could hear Jimmy scream over the crushing wind. Short on breath, David breathed into his mask. Jimmy clung to his harness for dear life. The plane swung upward and then upside down. Jimmy blacked out for a moment. When he awoke, he was upright again, but now the German plane was in front of them. David had pulled off some kind of loop-de-loop, and Jimmy was the clown of a flying circus. "Mama!" Jimmy screamed. He felt the air leave his lungs. The German raised his left hand and made some chopping motions in the air for David to see. David assumed they were a curse on all of his future generations. Time was up. David let loose all the firepower he had into the rear of the Fokker. He watched as smoke filled the sky. The plane dropped from sight. Jimmy hastily climbed back into his seat, but did not remove the harness. He breathed deeply into his mask as he watched the fighter plane drift into a tailspin. He patted David's shoulder. David gave a thumbs up. The countryside below was dotted with rows of neatly plotted grapevines. The land looked vibrant and pristine in comparison to the blackened battlefields that David was used to seeing from the sky. An elderly man, a small child, and their bouncing dog came into view as David swooped in. Will is a lucky man, he thought as he set the plane down in a clearing. David jumped from the plane and extended a hand to Jimmy. Jimmy gratefully took the assist. He landed on the ground shakily, but David caught him. The elderly man and the little girl greeted them warmly. The group marched up toward a very fine house, the dog leading the way. A tall black man was waiting for them at the door. Over dinner and wine in his lavish home, Willard joked and provoked David at will. Jimmy smiled, appearing to have forgotten the horrific dogfight earlier in the day. Willard's dog, Bud, jumped up behind David, almost knocking him out of his chair. David spun around and muzzled him. Bud let out a whimper. "He remembers me," David suddenly choked up. "Probably feels like a lifetime since I was last here." "Time passes strangely out here in the country," Willard replied. "We're still in the same war, right?" he joked. "Oh yeah," David said. Willard pointed at the back of his brown hand. Took them 4 years to realize they needed us to get the job done. He smiled at Jimmy. "Young Master Peyton," he beamed. "Make yourself at home. Bud and I are happy to have some company." Marcel and his granddaughter, Elise, who first greeted the plane, brought in dessert. Elise climbed into David's lap and tried to feed him dessert. David laughed. "From what I see here," David said to Willard, "you have plenty of company." Willard raised his wine glass to Marcel. "Well, the Gerards were here long before I bought the place. The best vintners in the world. Good people." Marcel waved away David's praise. "The people are only as good as the country," he said. On the couch, David and Willard smoked and drank some more wine. Jimmy stood before the fireplace, transfixed by a model plane on the mantel. It was a replica of the plane that brought him and David to Willard, but it had an insignia painted on the side. Willard peered over Jimmy's shoulder. "That's Daisy," Willard said. "A teeny tiny Daisy." "You tell Jimmy about her, David?" he asked over his shoulder. "Haven't had the time to talk about my plane," David replied from the couch. "Been trying to stay alive." Willard returned to the couch. "Oh, no. How could you not find time to talk about such a fine girl? I will never stop talking about my plane." Willard pointed at David. "Hero of the Lafayette Escadrille." David waved Willard off and took another drink. "Don't believe everything this man tells you, kiddo," David said to Jimmy. "He's a hell of a liar." Willard raised his hand in mock innocence. "I only lied to the mademoiselle's son. Everything else is true to God," he said. Willard turned serious. "You are in the company of one of the finest soldiers to ever serve France, and he's fool enough to be doing it again." As Willard droned on, David leaned back to rest his head on the back of the couch. He closed his eyes to rest them for a moment. As he drifted off, Willard's words brought up long-buried memories of his first service to France. Argonne Forest, 3 years ago. In a thicket, David leaned over an injured Willard. In the distance, smoke plumed from their wrecked plane. They had been shot down. Flying signal reconnaissance less than an hour before. They had spotted their objective on a hill below, a new enemy weapon. Barely a rumor up until that moment, the massive gun showed its power when a cluster of enemy soldiers rigged it to fire a test shot. David and Willard watched from above as shock waves rippled across the land. A village miles away went up in a fireball. Distracted by the powerful demonstration below, neither pilot noticed the rocket hurtling toward their plane until the last minute. The projectile dipped a wing and they fell from the sky. Miraculously, they had survived. After running a good distance away from the crashed plane, Will's legs gave out. David carried his friend, fearing capture. They stumbled upon their hiding place a moment later. Willard tried to hand David his pistol, and David pushed it back. "You're gonna need that," he said. "I'm leading them away from here. I'll circle back for you." "Don't come back for me," Willard rasped. "You can make it to the rendezvous point." David could not imagine leaving Willard behind to die alone in the forest, or worse, be captured by the enemy. Willard had always been the strong and confident leader, and David would follow him anywhere in this world and beyond. Seeing a friend immobile in a hostile place with white men closing in felt eerily familiar. David shook his head to clear away that troubling memory. "Nah, Negro," David whispered back. "You still owe me some money. Help is coming. I radioed our location. I'm just buying us time." "Man, what was that?" Willard asked. David knew he was talking about the weapon. Willard looked amazed. "The fires of hell," David said as he packed a small sack, which included a special camera. "That was a test. Looks like their new weapon is everything we feared." David pulled a blanket over Will and propped his head on a rolled up jacket. "Just wait here and don't make a sound," he said. "You can spend your time counting up what you owe me." David covered Willard completely with long tree branches to hide his friend from sight. Footsteps were closing in, so David made as much noise as possible as he took off in an opposite direction. The footsteps shifted in his direction. As David dodged through the brush, the sky grew unnaturally dark. He realized it was black smoke, likely from the weapon that failed their plane. Coughing, David considered the smoke a mixed blessing. Perfect cover from his pursuers, but a bad sign of what he'd eventually find. The running footsteps eventually faded away, but David kept running. A vine tripped him and he hit the ground. David frantically grabbed for the sack on his shoulder, catching it before the camera inside could hit the ground. Panting and stifling a cough, David crawled for a time under the smoke. There was no considerable heat, so he did not believe he was trapped in a forest fire. The smoke cleared to reveal a small village. A light breeze pushed the black fog away. David stood and inhaled the cool air and coughed out smoke. The village was in ruins. Charred bodies covered the ground. Old men, women, and children. Innocents. David grit his teeth. It was everything he had feared. A shopkeeper crawled from his doorway toward David. His face was singed, and his chest was a gaping hole filled with ash. David rushed to his side. The man clawed at David's arm. David took the man's one good hand and gently squeezed it. "What is your name?" David asked in French. He didn't bother to ask what happened. They had only moments left. The man wheezed and gurgled in agony. He then raised his arm to plead for death. David nodded his understanding. Standing, he drew his pistol and shot the man in the head. The body went still. David backed away, knowing that the shot was likely heard by the Germans. He stopped when he felt the nose of a pistol in his back. David did not panic. The person behind him obviously would have killed him long before. "What do you want?" David asked in French. When there was no answer, he repeated the question in broken German. "No more war," came a man's reply in broken English. David spun around and put his hands up. The German soldier held the gun on him, but his arm was shaking. "No more?" David asked as he nodded toward the destruction all around him. "Looks like you're just getting started." The soldier lowered his weapon. "I did not want this. I was told we were protecting the fatherland. This village was a test of a new and terrible weapon," he said. David saw horror in the man's eyes. "My name is Klaus, and I want to go home," he said. Klaus started to hand his weapon to David when they both heard rustling in the woods. The two men ran into an abandoned barn. The interior was filled with equipment and hay. David and Klaus took out of sight of the barn's doorway and waited. They heard a grunt from outside. David peered outside and saw two German soldiers dragging Will behind them. His hands were bound by rope. David was proud that his friend stayed on his feet. "Come out and see about your friend, nigger soldier," one of the Germans shouted. "He wants to say goodbye to you." David exchanged looks with Klaus, who gave him a nod. David had to make a judgment call, wondering if a deserter was going to back him or surrender. David signaled for Klaus to follow his lead. David holstered his gun and exited the barn with his arms up. "There you are," the first German soldier said. "Over here with your friend." The second soldier shoved Willard to his knees and gestured for David to come forward and do the same. "Sorry, man," Willard said. "We had a good run," David replied as he walked toward the second soldier. A shot rang out from the barn, and the first German soldier fell to his knees with a shout. Before the second soldier could react, David drew his pistol and shot him dead. Willard tipped over. David turned to the deserter, standing over Willard's former captor. "Klaus," he said, surprised. Klaus leaned down and shoved his gun into his former fellow soldier's face and fired. A short while later, Foreign Legion soldiers emerged from the smoky forest and secured the scene. Klaus raised his hands in surrender. "He is an asset," David shouted in French as he pointed at Klaus. David helped Willard to his feet. Two soldiers escorted Klaus over to them. Willard studied Klaus. He was a typical German soldier, blond and blue-eyed. "Oh, so you wrote me off and found a new friend that quick," Willard joked. "Yep," David said. Willard nodded his approval at Klaus. "Well, I guess you all right. David never brings anybody home." The next morning, Willard, David, and Jimmy cruised down an open road in a vintage luxury car. They passed a sign that read, "Montmartre, 60 kilometers. Willard used his clout as a retired officer at a French checkpoint, explaining that David and Jimmy were nephews visiting from the States. They were all dressed in Willard's civilian clothes. All of their uniforms were in the trunk. Willard looked over at David. "Hey, whatever happened to that German soldier who ended up with us back then?" David was preoccupied. "Who?" "Oh, him. His name is Klaus. He's been on our side since then. I convinced Forbes to not keep him as a prisoner. He seemed like he could be an asset. He's proven me right. We put him on special details or translating between us and German soldiers." "Never trust him completely," Willard said. "It's been 3 years, David said. "I'm not concerned about him. The Germans won't take him back. They'd kill him." David turned around in the passenger seat to check on Jimmy, who was unusually quiet. "You okay back there?" he asked. "How fast can this baby go?" Jimmy asked. David turned back around to exchange a knowing grin with Willard. Willard hit the gas. "Hang on, son." Back in uniform, David and Jimmy surveyed the Maison d'Enchanté's showroom, a nightclub in the famous Montmartre district in the Rue de Clichy. The dimly lit room had the traditional red-themed interior of Parisian clubs. An elderly man played a sad folk tune as a young girl set tables. David scanned the room until he found who he was looking for. Madame Pye, the owner, sat in a booth in the back of the room. She watched David for a moment, then beckoned him with a subtle wave of her hand. "Wait here," David told Jimmy. Jimmy took a seat at one of the tables. A can-can girl approached to take his drink order. A waiter rushed to Madame's side. His quick reaction time and military haircut revealed that he was one of her henchmen. Little did Madame nor Jimmy know, it was Klaus. He patted David down and took his pistol. In character, David gave him a dirty look. Madam Pie counted receipts as David slid into the booth. A glamorous woman with brown skin, she was dressed like an empress, bejeweled with rings on her fingers. She was an ageless beauty with warm brown skin, but David felt a chill from across the table. "Bonjour, Sergeant," she said in accented English with a heavy dose of German. David surmised she was likely from East Africa, a spoil of German conquest. "Welcome to my club. I've heard good things about your band." David was direct. "I was told I could find Giselle here," he said. Madam Pie stopped counting. "Americans," she crinkled her nose in disdain. "Everything right now. No pleasantries. Funny, I've heard the same expression from Giselle, or whatever her real name is," David said. "Tell me, what's pleasant about war? About ending the world?" Madam Pie's face relaxed again into an icy mask. "You Yankees are new to this story," she said. "So much you do not understand. Orphan." David frowned. General Le Gallais, commander of the French 16th Division, called David's regiment "my orphans" in a fond, if not naive, sort of way. He didn't like the way Madam Pie said it. "This is a war between empires," Madam Pie said. "This is a war between empires. What if you're serving the wrong one?" David asked. Madam Pie looked taken aback. David could tell that she was accustomed to obedience. He had ruffled her feathers. "Young man, this war has nothing to do with right and wrong," she said. "It is about the strong and the weak." "Depends on who you believe is the strong one," David replied. The ghost of a smile crept across Madam Pie's face. "Ah," she said with faint delight, "I see that you are no one's orphan. What you do next will tell me who you really are." Madam Pie took out a cigarette. David lit it for her with his own lighter. She took a puff, then offered the cigarette to him, but he declined. "She owes her life to you, doesn't she?" he asked softly. Madam Pie's eye took on a faraway look. "Let us just say we gave her a new start in life, a purpose. Giselle obviously has served you all for some time," David said. "When will you set her free?" Madam Pie looked pained for a moment. "And she will go with you? Where? To your America? Land of the free?" she mocked. David refused to fall prey to Madam Pie's dark magic. She made a good point about the States, but David would not give her the satisfaction. "You would do well to stay here and serve the Empire too," she added. David slammed the table, and Madam Pie jumped in her seat, her spell suddenly broken. "That, madame, will never happen," David said through clenched teeth. David deliberately avoided making eye contact with Klaus. Jimmy leapt to his feet. Madam Pie waved Klaus, her man, away. David signaled for Jimmy to sit back down. David leaned in toward Madam Pie. We are here to topple your empire." Madam Pie looked both offended and impressed. She took a leisurely drag of her cigarette. "My Giselle would not leave with you in the end," she declared. However, David could swear he heard a tinge of doubt in Madam's voice. "Deep down, Giselle knows herself," Madam warned. "You should let her go now, before you lose yourself and everything you hold dear." "Can't do that," David replied. "Where can I find her?" Madam Pie sighed. "Perhaps you are a sign." "Of what?" "The apocalypse," she replied with a smirk. "An American soldier rescuing a German operative." David's pulse raced at the thought of Giselle being in danger as they spoke. Madam Pie pulled out a map and spread it across the table. He pointed to a French army outpost. "Her last known location," Madam said. "Giselle has missed 2 check-ins. Her handler is missing as well. Giselle may need extraction." Then I'm your man, David said.